Dylan held the guitar. He looked at the audience. And he waited. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. 40 seconds. No one breathed. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with something unspoken, something building, something about to break. The kind of silence that happens before a confession, before a line gets crossed, before someone does what they swore they'd never do. Dylan sat on a wooden stool under a single spotlight. The Beacon Theater in New York. November 1993. 2,000 people in the darkness beyond the light. They'd come to hear the voice of a generation. The poet. The prophet. The man who'd written the soundtrack to their youth and their rage and their hope. But right now, in this moment, they weren't hearing anything. They were watching Bob Dylan sit perfectly still, his fingers hovering above the strings of his Martin acoustic, his eyes closed, his face carrying the weight of something they couldn't see but could feel pressing down on the room. Someone coughed in the balcony. The sound echoed. Dylan didn't react. His band stood behind him in the shadows, musicians who'd played with him for years, who knew his moods, his silences, his sudden changes of direction. They waited. They knew better than to interrupt whatever was happening. 50 seconds of silence. Then Dylan's fingers touched the strings. Not strumming. Just resting there. Still not playing. And then, so quietly that the people in the back rows had to lean forward to hear, he spoke. "I wrote a song once," Dylan said, his voice gravelly, barely above a whisper. "Long time ago. 1965. Never played it for anyone. Never recorded it. Put it in a drawer and told myself I'd leave it there." The audience was frozen. Bob Dylan didn't do this. He didn't explain. He didn't share. He sang, and if you understood, you understood. If you didn't, that was your problem. But tonight something was different. "I'm gonna play it now," Dylan said. "And I need you to understand something before I do." His eyes opened. He looked out into the darkness where 2,000 people sat holding their breath. "This song," he continued, "is about the worst thing I ever did." Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1965. Bob Dylan wasn't yet Bob Dylan, not the legend, not the myth. He was 24 years old, and already carrying more weight than any person should have to carry. 3 years of being called the voice of a generation. 3 years of every word analyzed, every song dissected, every decision questioned. He was exhausted. Burning out. The folk movement wanted him to stay pure, acoustic, angry. The rock world wanted him to go electric, get louder, get commercial. Everyone had an opinion about what Bob Dylan should be. No one asked what Bob Dylan wanted. That summer, he was dating a woman named Sarah Lownds. Quiet. Private. She didn't care about his fame. She worked with children. She played piano. She made him feel, for brief moments, like maybe he could just be a person instead of a symbol. They'd been together for 6 months. Dylan was falling in love in a way that terrified him because it was real and good, and completely incompatible with the life he was living. One night in July, they were in his apartment in New York. Sarah was making dinner. Dylan was in the other room with his guitar, trying to write a new song for his upcoming album. The label wanted hits. The fans wanted anthems. Dylan wanted to write something true. The melody came first. Simple. Honest. 4 chords. Then the words started flowing. Not about protests or politics or the state of the world, but about loving someone and knowing you're going to destroy it. About being the kind of person who ruins good things because he can't stop being who he is. He called it The Burning Room. A song about watching love turn to ash in your hands while you hold the match. Dylan wrote it in 40 minutes. Every verse. Every word. He played it through once, sitting alone, and knew immediately that it was the best thing he'd ever written. Not the most important. Not the most influential. But the truest. And he knew he could never let anyone hear it. Because the burning room wasn't universal. It wasn't about the movement, or the generation, or the times. It was about Sarah. About how he loved her, and how he was going to leave her anyway because that's what he did. That's what the road demanded. That's what being Bob Dylan meant. 3 weeks later, he told Sarah it was over. He didn't give her a reason. He just said he couldn't do it anymore. She cried. He didn't. He'd learned not to. Sarah Lownds left that night. Dylan never spoke to her again. He took the handwritten lyrics to The Burning Room, folded them carefully, and put them in a wooden box in his closet. He told himself he'd destroy them eventually. He never did. But he swore, to himself, to whatever conscience still functioned inside him, that he would never play that song. Never let it exist beyond those 4 walls where he'd written it. It belonged to the worst version of himself. The coward. The destroyer. The man who chose the road over the person. For 20 years, Bob Dylan kept that promise. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. The Beacon Theatre. November 1993. Dylan was 52 years old now. Gray in his hair. Lines on his face. Decades of touring. Hundreds of songs. Thousands of shows. He'd gotten married to someone else in the 70s. Divorced. Had children. Kept touring. Kept writing. Kept being Bob Dylan because that's what the world needed him to be. But lately, something had been shifting. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was just time. 3 months before this concert, Dylan had been cleaning out storage in his Minnesota property. Old boxes. Old files. Old lives packed away in cardboard. He found the wooden box. Inside it, folded exactly as he'd left it 20 years ago, were the lyrics to The Burning Room. Dylan sat on the floor of that storage room and read the words he'd written as a 24-year-old kid who thought running away made him strong. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, he let himself think about Sarah Lownds. He hired a private investigator. It took 2 weeks to find her. Sarah Lownds was now Sarah Friedman. She'd gotten married in 1968. Had 3 children. Became a music teacher in a small town in Vermont. She'd built a good life. A quiet life. The kind of life Dylan had walked away from because it felt like a cage. The investigator gave Dylan an address. A phone number. Dylan sat with that information for 6 weeks, staring at it, wondering what the hell he was supposed to do with it. He never called. Couldn't. What would he say? Sorry I destroyed you when we were young. Thanks for being the good thing I threw away. But he thought about her. About what she tried to give him. About the song he'd written and hidden because it told the truth about who he'd been. The night of the Beacon Theatre show, Dylan arrived at soundcheck with the folded lyrics in his jacket pocket. He hadn't planned to play it. Hadn't told his band. Hadn't added it to the set list. But standing on that stage in front of 2,000 people, about to play his 20th song of a retrospective concert celebrating 30 years of music, Dylan felt the weight of that paper in his pocket. And he made a decision. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. The silence stretched to 60 seconds now. Someone in the front row whispered to their companion. Dylan heard it. He didn't acknowledge it. His fingers finally moved on the strings. Not a chord. Just a single note. Sustained. Hanging in the air like a question. Her name was Sarah, Dylan said, his voice quiet but clear. I loved her. I left her. This song is about that. He began to play. The melody was simple. 4 chords in a minor progression. Slower than anything he'd played all night. His voice, rougher now than in 1965, carried the words he'd written 28 years ago. I built a burning room with walls made of your trust. I struck the match myself. I watched it turn to dust. You asked me why I'm leaving. I got no good reply. Some men are born to run from everything they recognize. The Beacon Theatre was absolutely silent. No one moved. 2,000 people listening to a song that had never been heard before. A confession from a man who'd spent his entire career hiding behind metaphor and mystery. You said you'd wait forever if I'd only stay the night? I kissed you at the doorway and I stepped into the light. The burning room is empty now, just ashes on the floor. I'm still running from the one thing I was running for. Dylan's voice cracked on the last line. He kept playing. Eyes closed. Fingers steady despite everything. In the front row, a woman in her late 60s was crying. Her companion put an arm around her shoulders. She whispered something Dylan couldn't hear. But somehow, in that moment, he knew. He didn't know how he knew. Maybe the way she sat. Maybe some ghost of recognition across 28 years and 1,000 changes. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But when Dylan opened his eyes between verses and looked into the audience, he saw her. Sarah. Older. Gray hair. Glasses. But unmistakably her. Sitting in the third row. Crying quietly. Listening to the song he'd written about destroying what they'd had. Dylan's fingers faltered. For a fraction of a second, the music stopped. Then he kept playing. Because what else could he do? Turn back time? Undo it? Explain? No. All he could do was finish the song. I see your face in strangers on every empty road. I hear your voice in silence in every cheap hotel. The burning room is all I own, it follows where I go. I'm carrying the ashes of the love I couldn't hold. The final chord rang out. Dylan let it fade completely before he lifted his hands from the guitar. The audience didn't applaud immediately. They were processing. Trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. Then someone started clapping. Slowly. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire Beacon Theater was on its feet, not the wild applause of entertainment, but the quiet, respectful applause of people who'd just seen something true. Dylan didn't bow. Didn't smile. He just sat there, looking at Sarah in the third row. She was standing with the others, tears streaming down her face. Their eyes met across the distance. Dylan lifted one hand. A small wave. Acknowledgement. Apology. Gratitude. Everything and nothing. Sarah nodded once. Then she turned and walked up the aisle toward the exit. Dylan watched her go. He didn't call out. Didn't chase. That wasn't who he was. He turned to his band. Let's take 5, he said quietly. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan walked off stage. His manager met him in the wings. Bob, what the hell was that? That song's not on any album. I've never even... It's not, Dylan interrupted. And it won't be. But it was incredible. People are going to want... They can want, Dylan said. They're not getting it. He went to his dressing room. Sat down. Pulled the folded lyrics from his pocket, and looked at them one last time. Then he tore them in half. And half again. And again. Until there were confetti in his hands. He threw them in the trash. Bob Dylan never played The Burning Room again. Never recorded it. Never spoke about it in interviews. The people who were at the Beacon Theater that night told the story, but without a recording, without proof, it became something like myth. Some people who were there swear Dylan cried during the performance. Others say he was stoic the whole time. Some remember Sarah walking out. Others say there was no woman in the third row, that the whole thing was symbolic, that Dylan was singing to a ghost. Dylan never confirmed or denied any of it. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. What changed that night wasn't the world. It was Dylan. The next album he recorded had a different quality, softer, more direct, less hiding. Critics noticed. Fans noticed. Dylan didn't comment. Years later, a journalist asked him about lost songs, unreleased material, things in the vault. Everything that needs to exist exists, Dylan said. The rest should stay buried. No regrets? The journalist pressed. Dylan was quiet for a long moment. Regret doesn't change what you did, he finally said. It just means you know better now than you did then. That's all growth is. Knowing better. Doing better when you get the chance. And if you don't get the chance? Dylan smiled slightly. Then you play the song once and let it go. The lyrics he tore up that night were never found. Dylan told his estate to destroy any recordings from the Beacon Theatre show. They did. But everyone who was there remembers. The pause. The confession. The melody no one had heard before or since. Some say Sarah sent him a letter months later. One sentence. Thank you for finishing it. Dylan never confirmed that either. But after 1993, he started playing different. Older songs with new weight. New songs with old honesty. Like a man who'd finally set something down he'd been carrying too long. The burning room was empty now. And Dylan kept walking.